Much to discuss about the G20 Summit, all those issues that Stephen mentioned. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in the studio is Arthur Dong. He's a professor with the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. From Buenos Aires, Qinduo Xu is a senior fellow with the Pangoal Institution. Also in Buenos Aires, Lida Preyma is the director of capital markets research at the G20 Research Group. And Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University right here in Washington, D.C. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Anton, let's start in the studio. This is one of the most important gatherings of world leaders in the year. But it comes at a crucial time, doesn't it? Because we have these rising tensions between the United States and Russia over Ukraine, trade tensions between the United States and China. And then we throw into that mix, of course, the presence of a Saudi Arabian leader at the G20 who is suspected of ordering the murder of a journalist. Given all of that, what do you think will come out of this G20?
Well, it's always very dangerous to expect great breakthroughs at major events such as these. Most of the work of diplomacy happens between ministers and their staffs, and this is what we do not see. These things are more PR sort of events. We do see the tensions on the surface. A lot of meetings canceled between Trump and Putin, and of course Trump and May of Great Britain. We'll see how that works out. So, but there's also an international stage for the leaders of the world to voice their differences and to identify ways to overcome them. And we will see with the communique, if such is finalized, how these leaders envision getting over the difficulties that everyone knows about, and they've all been stated clearly. We'll see.
There's some pretty big differences, though, out there, Anton. I mean, there's big philosophical differences among these countries. Like you have one group of countries, as Stephen mentioned, talking about multilateralism, and another group of countries talking, I guess, protectionism or unilateralism.
Yeah, it looks like China and Russia and many others are in the multilateralist, internationalist camp, which is really remarkable for me even to say. It sounds so strange because the United States has historically been the engine of globalization and opening markets. But listen, the way that history works, internationalization, open seas, always is the program that favors the most powerful economy in the world. The British were pushing for this throughout the 19th century when it favored their empire. So we're seeing the roles being reversed right now. The trend, in my estimation, however, is towards the eclipse of American hegemony and the rise of these new powers. So again, as I've said many times on this program also, we're living through a tectonic shift in global geopolitics with the rise of new powers. So now it's really up to the United States to handle this reapportionment of the balance of power in a way that is in its benefits and not to the loss of everyone else.
All right, let's go to Qinduo Xu. He's in Buenos Aires. And Qinduo, the big issue at this G20, even before the meeting started, was, of course, the issue of protectionism. It's a sort of big shadow that's hanging over this meeting. Let's listen to what President Trump said about the current trade dispute with China. Let's watch.
We'll be meeting with President Xi in a little while, but for the most part tomorrow, I would say, would be our big meeting. But in the meantime, people are working, our staff is working, and we have a lot of very talented people working. Larry Kudlow's representatives are dealing with them on a constant basis. There's some good signs. We'll see what happens.
So, Qinduo, there we heard the president say there are some good signs. That's an optimistic note. What are the prospects for some kind of resolution to this dispute?
Well, I tend to be optimistic. I think there's still a chance for the two leaders to reach at least a framework of agreement, to point out the direction for the two teams, one from Washington, one from Beijing, so they can continue to negotiate, continue to talk to each other, to iron out the differences in order to reach a complete agreement, to solve the concerns of Washington and also the concerns of Beijing. They have to find a solution somehow, acceptable to both sides. Otherwise, I think neither country will benefit from that kind of a scenario, which is probably the worst. That is full frontal confrontation against each other in Beijing and Washington, not only in the trade sector, but also that could spill over to other sectors. That is not only bad to both countries, but also to the whole world, given how powerful the two economies, the two countries are.
Let's bring in Lida Preyma. She's also in Buenos Aires. And Lida, there are some big challenges that all these leaders face. We've just been talking about some of them, the trade disputes, security issues, climate change. That's another big one. But there has already been one big deal that's been signed, and that is the new trade deal between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. The Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, described it as modernizing NAFTA. How big an achievement is that?
Well, I think we have to still wait and see whether it's going to be ratified or not. What we have at this summit is you've got President Trump, who has now lost the House of Representatives, so that still needs to be ratified, and the Democrats have signaled that they would like to negotiate it a little further. The Mexican president, today is his last day on the job. There's a new president that's inaugurated tomorrow, and we'll wait and see whether he wants to ratify this. So in Canada, I think all the sleepless nights are not quite over yet.
Arthur, ratification, a big thing in the US Congress especially, and we know that there'll be at least one house that'll change hands in Congress. The Democrats will be in the majority in the House of Representatives. So what are the chances that they may reject this deal or ask for amendments?
I believe there, if anything, there might be some amendment and some fine-tuning of the document as it stands. The Democrats certainly are going to voice their concerns with regard to the agreement as it has presently been structured, and they're going to want to take a look and insert some things that are more to their liking.
Anton, there was a planned meeting between President Trump and President Putin. That was cancelled by the United States. Now it's reported there may be some kind of what's been described as an impromptu meeting. Not sure what that is, but the issue is Ukraine, Russia's seizure of naval vessels, Ukrainian naval vessels. Where do you think this is going? Will it be resolved?
I think the conflict, the immediate conflict over the Sea of Azov will be resolved, but here it will be on the Russians and the Ukrainians to come to an agreement. What we know so far is that the facts are still unclear because we've got two competing narratives going on about what happened. We know that the crisis benefits the Ukrainian leadership much more than it benefits the Russian leadership. If Putin gets an uptick in his popularity in Russia, which is already very high, it'll be a benefit, but not as much as the uptick in the popularity of Poroshenko, who had, this is the Ukrainian president, who is facing re-election in March. His approval ratings are between the single digits and about 12%, depending on which polls you look at. He does not look like he's going to win. And now, of course, the crisis is attracting attention to Ukraine. It's stimulating support for Ukraine and opposition to Russia. And he's hoping to use that as an election ploy. It probably won't work. His parliament already cut back the programs he had proposed imposing, including martial law in Ukraine. He wanted 2 months. He got 1 month. He wanted the whole country. He only got 10 provinces, all of them, by the way, for the most part, pro-Yanukovych, the previous president. So the crisis probably resulted from miscommunication. It's been blown out of proportion. No one wants a war there because if that happens, the losers of that war will be first the Ukrainians, second the Europeans, and third the Russians, of course. So I think this will be solved, but after the hysteria dies down and coolness returns and the emotions are calmed.
A miscalculation, you say, but Anton, how surprised are you by the fact that this happened just days before the G20 summit?
Well, this is what many people argue in favor of the Ukrainian sort of agency in this conflict. Putin didn't need this before he went to Buenos Aires. It just makes no sense for him. First of all, we know that 2 Ukrainian boats, military boats, passed through the same strait 2 months ago with no problems, having followed the exact protocol worked out between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and now this takes place. So probably not fully accidental, but again, we don't know. We'll have to see how it works out.
Okay. Qinduo, no doubt one big challenge that President Xi will be taking to this G20 summit will be to convince the United States of the benefits of multilateralism. And in that respect, he does have the support of BRICS partners. They issued a statement earlier today talking about protectionism. What can you tell us about that? And is China going to be able to persuade the... we have lost Qinduo. That is a technical problem. Let me go back to Lida, who is in Buenos Aires. And Lida, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he addressed the recent announcement by General Motors talking about trade here to close 5 plants. He had this message for President Trump. Let's listen to it.
As I discussed with President Trump a few days ago, the recent plant closures by General Motors, which affects thousands of Canadian and American workers and their families, are a heavy blow. Make no mistake, we will stand up for our workers and fight for their families and their communities. And Donald, it's all the more reason why we need to keep working to remove the tariffs on steel and aluminum between our countries.
So, Lida, what do you make of this? And do you think there'll be any movement on it?
It's a very good question. I think that if there's going to be any movement, it's not going to come anytime soon. As we've been talking about, especially here at the G20, what we've seen for the first time last year in Hamburg is that anti-protection policy, that wording has come off of the communique as of last year. So we're not going to see it again this year. And it really does remain to be seen whether or not we're going to even have a communique or perhaps maybe a chair statement instead, so that I mean, what's better, to have a watered down communique or just a statement that nobody's really bound to, which would be a chair statement. But as far as Canada and the US are concerned with the steel and aluminum tariffs, it's really hard to predict right now what's going to happen. How Trump's going to feel, what his decisions are going to be. I think it's going to be an interesting take when we see the new Congress and see what happens on that front as well. So it's tough to predict.
Here's the question, Lida. What does President Trump want from the Canadians?
That is the million-dollar question. He wants... He keeps saying that he wants a more fair deal, but we've had the renegotiation of the USMCA, which in Canada is legally going to be written as the CUSMA, and it changes from day to day and from tweet to tweet what Trump wants from Canada. If we take a look back at the Charlevoix summit back in June, he got terribly offended, as did some of his senior staff, about comments from Prime Minister Trudeau that had actually been said in previous times in the past. We as Canadians we also look for a fair deal, and we've been negotiating in good faith, and now we have to see whether this gets ratified. But I know that Canada does want reconsideration for the steel tariffs.
That's something we haven't heard for a long time. Tweet to tweet, isn't it? Let's go back to Qinduo. I think we have him with us right now. And Qinduo, I want to ask you about this issue on protectionism and wondering about the kind of persuasive powers that President Xi will be taking to the summit to try and convince President Trump on the benefits of multilateralism. President Xi does have the support of his BRICS partners. They issued a statement earlier today, in which they also supported the idea of multilateralism. So what are the prospects for President Xi getting something out of this?
Well, I think, of course, President Xi did not only enjoy the support of his fellow, friends from these BRICS partners like Russia, India, South Africa, and Brazil, because all those emerging economies, they benefit a lot from globalization of free trade or multilateral trading system with the WTO at its core. I think it also, he enjoys support from, partners in European countries, Germany, France, even Britain, and also other members like Argentina, the hosting country. Argentine foreign minister earlier said that, globalization, the benefits from globalization and free trade will not come out overnight, but it will come, and be felt over the time. So I think the problem between China and the United States right now is really about the U.S. somehow feels like they are treated unfairly. They will solve the problem with the Chinese side and dealing with the deficit, so-called trade of deficit. But the problem is going beyond that. It's becoming more complicated, so-called like issues with China's industrial policy. It's actually a matter of sovereignty. Of course, the U.S. side is not happy. The Chinese side basically makes it open, like as long as we can, reach a framework, like have a pause in terms of the trade tension, without the imposition of new tariffs on the rest of the goods, or increase the tariff from 10% to 25% starting from January. So we can talk about some of all the issues. The Chinese side is very open, actually. Whatever topics you are not happy, we can talk about that. But if you look at the situation right now, the U.S. side basically is providing a long list of demands, and their negotiating style, like here are the questions. The Chinese side, you need to meet all the demands. So I think the Chinese side is not happy with that. Somehow, as long as the negotiation, it requires compromise from both sides, requires accommodation of each other, because trade ultimately serves the interests of both nations here.
Arthur, is it a question of style or is it a question of substance? Because, as Lida told us a moment ago, there's a big question mark over what the United States wants. And we also hear that from the Chinese. What does President Trump want?
Yeah, I do believe that there are many substantive issues that are on the table that the United States sides, that certainly President Trump would like to see altered. The question of intellectual property transfer, the question of more openness towards American companies engaging and having greater participation in the Chinese marketplace, as well as the greater sort of interest and participation on behalf of China to resolve the trade imbalance by buying more U.S.-based products and goods.
Right, but on the style issue that Qinduo mentioned, Arthur, with the Americans saying, well, we want you to agree to all our demands first, and then we'll negotiate.
Yeah, it's a little bit, it's not a velvet glove, a little bit more of a hammer than a velvet glove.
Right.
So it's certainly an attitudinal and certainly a different sort of approach that Donald Trump brings to the table. I think all world leaders are aware that he has a very, very different style, as compared to previous presidents.
Yeah, and Anton, here is something that we don't hear very often from President Putin. He's been very critical of America's, or Trump's America First policy. He condemned what he called, this is Vladimir Putin, the president, condemned what he called dishonest competition and vicious sanctions and protectionist measures. How is that America First policy affecting Russia, and what about sanctions? I mean, what impact is that having?
Well, so Putin's criticism, of course, was specifically about sanctions, because the Russians are suspecting that the sanctions really have little to do with Russian behavior and more to do with preventing the Russians from emerging as a serious competitor to the United States, not only in terms of energy exports, because one of the big issues, of course, is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the very proactive lobbying by the Trump administration of American liquefied natural gas being exported to Europe and making up for what they hope will be the cancellation of a pipeline. The Europeans aren't going along with that. We know that already. It's the Germans, really, because they understand it's cheaper to import Russian gas. And as long as there are no middlemen, such as Ukraine, involved in the transfers, the Germans have never complained about Russian deliveries because the Russians have been eminently reliable. Now, of course, the Russians and the Turks have agreed to build a pipeline. So the Russians seem to think that sanctions they're sold as a geopolitical sort of punishment for Russian behavior. But in reality, this is an economic lever. And the other side of this issue, of course, for the Russians are weapons sales. The United States is the largest exporter of military hardware in the world by far. The Russians are fairly close. And the Americans have gone out of their way to try to block other countries, including India and Turkey, from buying Russian weapons. So the sanctions affect that also. From the Russian perspective, what they see is the West being hypocritical about Russian international geopolitical behavior and simply using sanctions as an economic tool to sideline Russia as a competitor.
All right, Qinduo, I want to get to one other issue in the few minutes that we have left, and that is climate change. This will be on the agenda at the G20. Of course, the United States has pulled out of the Paris Accord, and that is given a chance to China to take the lead in implementing that accord. What can we expect there?
Well, I think China is playing an increasingly active role. Actually, in this morning, you have a trilateral meeting between the Chinese Foreign Minister and his counterpart from France, and also the UN Secretary General, Guterres. And they had a brief press meeting with the reporters, basically expressing their support of the Paris Agreement and looking forward to the implementation, but the detailed implementation of the agreement, despite the U.S. withdrawal from the work against the climate change. I think, there's a complete understanding, and also there's a strong national support, let's say, within China. There's no debate about the climate change, whether it's fake or scientific at all. So the government enjoys the public support. That is, we need to do something. And also it is in line with China's own energy policy, let's say. It's about having renewables. It's about having this new energy instead of the heavy reliance on the fossil energy. So I think for China, it simply just goes along with the national policy and also with this international trend against climate change. Of course, for France, they would love to have the Chinese support, and for the UN, the United Nations, they would love to have the Chinese support. China is the largest emissioner, so I think this is just it seems very well for these countries. But there is a concern, not only Trump, but also see the new president, the president-elect in Brazil. They're also talking about not complete withdrawal, but obviously there's a lack of enthusiasm in participating in the fight against the climate change. So it's kind of divided. It needs to be more united for the benefit of human beings, but it's not that ideal situation right now.
Okay, Lida, I want to get back to something you were talking about a moment ago, and whether there'd be a joint communique coming out of this G20 summit, or whether there'd be something called a chair statement. And I'm wondering how important it is for international markets to see some kind of agreement, even if it's very watered down, coming out of a big, important, significant meeting like this.
Well, it is important for the markets to see a unified leadership from the G20. And when you don't have a communique and only have a chair statement, it doesn't bound all of the leaders into action. And so what you're going to see is you're not going to see commitments from the different countries. Although if we're looking at the next summit, which is going to be in June in Japan for the G20, it's not really a lot of time in order to implement anything that's decided anyway. So people are looking at this summit potentially, even a few days ago going into it, that perhaps this was just going to be an elevated leaders meeting on the way to the summit in June. So it may not have that great of an impact. All of the, you mentioned all of the Argentinian priorities at the beginning. They've really taken second fiddle to everything else that's been going on here. So nobody's really expecting anything big and substantial to come out of it. Is it going to move markets? Likely not.
Okay, well, the meetings will continue. We'll see what comes out. There's one more day of meetings to take place. That's where we have to end it, though. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.